So, welcome to lecture number 12 of Kuzari. We are in the first essay, about to read paragraph 110, which, if you are following in the Korobkin English, this version, it would be on page 132. I doubt we'll get there tonight, but it's a remote possibility that we might finish the first essay tonight. Because we are approaching the end of the first essay. Now, the new background is because I happen to be in the hospital waiting for a patient who's in labor. So if I get called out in the middle, you'll have to forgive me. And also, I'll be a little bit less animated because when I'm at home, I can scream and yell at the top of my lungs when I'm teaching. But when I'm here, I'm sitting in the doctor's dining room and people walking around outside in the hall, and I just really don't want to draw too much attention to myself. So I'll be slightly less animated than usual. So forgive me. Maybe that's a good thing. Anyway, so we're about to read 110. And again, I'm reading from the Hebrew version, which is from this particular Hebrew version, which is Michael Schwartz's modern Hebrew translation directly from the Arabic. So hopefully we can follow inside. So Omar Kuzari. So what had just happened, just to remind you, is the Chaver, the rabbi, had just given a whole mashal, a whole parable about the king from India who sends his messengers and his gifts to some people in the desert, and the people build a relationship with this king based on seeing how great he is and how wonderful he is, and learning the things that he has to teach, and agreeing to do the things that he tells them to do, etc. And he used that as a parable to describe the relationship that the Jewish people have with God. We experienced him. He sent us his messengers, who are the prophets, and he gave us instructions of how he wants us to live, so on and so forth. That was and then the main point that he wanted to bring out with this is that the purpose of keeping those laws is not in order to gain some benefit that we don't see or can't define. Not because we're going to, when we die, we're somehow going to go to a special heaven, or if we don't do it, we're going to go to a terrible hell. But rather, it's because we have a relationship with that king, because we know him, we admire him, we experienced him. He lives with us, he helps us, he cares for us. And therefore, he told us to keep these laws because he wants us to do them, because they're good for us. And by doing these laws, by keeping these commandments, we're giving him pleasure, so to speak. We're doing what he wants us to do. So the reason for doing them is because of the value in it of themselves, because of that relationship we have with God, as opposed to doing them because we're going to get some prize that, after we die, that nobody can even prove to us even exists, and the reason why we avoid the things he tells us to avoid is not because of some mythical hell that we might burn in, if God forbid we don't listen to those rules. So that's what he had just said in 109. So those are very important points. And Amar Kuzari. So in 110, the Chazar king now responds, and that's where we're up to. Rachok min hahigayon. It doesn't seem reasonable to imagine that a person should involve his life in all kinds of things, right? And that his body will eventually just die, right? And die like an animal's body does. Only the philosophers think that. In other words, the Chazar king is saying that only the philosophers think that when we die, there's nothing left of us. We just go about our lives just like any animal. We eat, we drink, we have sex, we have babies, and then we die, and then we rot. Finished, and that's the end of the story, right? And it just doesn't make sense that should be the case. There must be something spiritual. There must be something special about the soul. Now, the Chazar king is accepting this. Now, if Jeffrey was talking before we started recording, well, when we have discussions with non-Jews, if we have discussions with people from other religions, then they almost always have some concept of a soul and an afterlife. But many of us have discussions with those of us who are not believers in any organized or any religion at all, and they actually believe that that's the end of the show. But the Chazar king is saying it just doesn't make sense that could be the case. Ve'ilu anshe hadasos, but all of the religious people of all of the various religions, omrim, they say, she'adam yichya la'ad ba'oneg al smach, but they say that a person will live on forever in some special, wonderful pleasure and peace, and the basis of mila achas sheyomer b'peh, the basis of one statement. Now think about this, right? He's directly talking about the Islamic Shahada. He doesn't say it, but he's talking about that, which is the Islamic proclamation of faith. But he also has in mind Christianity, where having belief in an idea, right, having belief in Jesus, right, then somehow merits you some great, wonderful thing in the afterlife, right? It somehow merits you some special thing. It doesn't make sense that those other religions think that just because of one thing you say, right, or one thing you believe, all of a sudden, poof, now you're in heaven and everything's wonderful and great and beautiful, right? There's some people that all they know their whole life is this one word, is this one statement, this one statement of faith. I believe in XYZ, whatever religion you're talking about, right? And some people barely even understand what they're saying. They're people of faith, so to speak, whether he's specifically referring to Christian or Islamic faith, right? But they don't even really understand their own faith. They don't know what it means. I believe in Muhammad, or I believe in Jesus, or whatever. They go about it because that's what they were taught and told. And madhim shemila achas tavir madregas habehemos udargas malachim. Suddenly, he goes from being just a plain old animal, right? And now he's like an angel. Now he's going to go on to some spiritual la land. And the opposite is also crazy to imagine. That all of a sudden a guy that refuses to say this statement, right, refuses to believe, so he's no longer an angelic, wonderful person with all these wonderful things, but because you refuse to believe in this idea, or you refuse to make this statement, right, all of a sudden you're a nobody, right, or worse. I feel imhu philosoph, even if you happen to be of an educated philosopher, who your entire life you've been searching for God, thinking and learning and studying and trying to be the best possible person you can be and living a good life, and all of a sudden, because you don't believe, poof, you're a terrible guy. Like, what kind of sense does that make? So this is the Chazer king saying this, and this is, of course, one of maybe the primary difference between Judaism and those other major Jewish religions today, right? You can go walk around your entire life and state Shema Yisrael, but if you're a jerk, you're a jerk, and God is going to treat you that way. That's just the way it goes, right? You can believe everything, and God doesn't. It's not about what you believe, right? Or you could not believe anything, but if you live a good life, you'll still get rewarded for it, right? So Amar Chaver, the Chaver answers, and this is paragraph 111. Ein anu shololim me'af echad. And Jeffrey, this kind of addresses your question, because let's leave out for a moment the difficult issue of Jewish superiority, which is inherent argument of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, right? I understand that it's difficult, and just know that Rambam doesn't agree with that argument, and we talked about that, and it'll come up again. But leaving that out, there's still many compelling arguments that Rabbi Yehuda Levi is making here in this book, and this is one of them. We don't take away from any human being, regardless of what nation he comes from, the reward for being a good person in the eyes of God. I don't care where you come from. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you believe in this or believe in that. I don't care if you're from India, from Pakistan, from Indonesia, or from native Australia, or whatever. I don't really give a darn. Are you a good person? Right? Right, in the eyes of God. And you're going to get rewarded for it. And you're good, and we admire you for what you've done and you accomplished and you achieved. Nowhere in the Jewish religion does it say that if you don't believe, or if you don't make this statement, you're going to go to hell, right? It's just not part of our religion. We do see, now here's that a little twist of which we were mentioned just a minute ago. It's a mala hashlema, but there is a special advantage, a special mala, those people that live a special life close to God. Inherent in that statement, there's nothing wrong with that. Those that live a special spiritual life close to God are on a higher level, and that's okay, right? but obviously he's referring to Jewish people that live that kind of life, but of course, anyone that lives a good life is fine, is going to be okay. God will still reward him or her, and so on. And whatever you achieve in your life, that is what somehow you will be rewarded, right, or punished, depending on the situation, after death. So remember, he said, in other words, it's not about after death, and that was an emphasis we emphasized last week. It's not about what's going to be after we die. It's not about that at all. It's about how we live. But based on how we live, there is some sort of eternal existence, right, that results from our lives. Exactly what that is. He's going to talk a little bit more. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that tonight or not. But the bottom line is the bottom line. If you live a good life, you're a good person, you'll be fine. If you don't, you're not fine. And it doesn't matter what you say, right? If you say the Shahada 16,000 times standing on your head, but if you're a jerk, you're still a jerk, right? And if you don't say it, and you live a good life, you're fine. Let's see paragraph 112. Amar Kuzari. So the Chazer said, but let's look at this in a different way, right? I wonder how he translates that. Let's look at this a different way. And now he's going to address something that it's an argument that's been used against the Jewish people until anti-Semitism takes on the form, depending on how. If Jews are good, they criticize us for being conspiratorial, guys in a smoky room running the world deviously, right? If Jews are bad, then they say, look at those guys, they're poor, they're despicable, they're nobodies, right? So in those days, in the days that this book is written, the Jews were on the bottom of the pile sociologically, right? So we were suffering. We were getting kicked out of country after country. We were being persecuted and so on. So he says now, let's compare, and by looking at the Jews to other people, by looking at the way you're telling me how great they're going to have it in the world to come, right? Well, what about this world, right? Let's look at their situation in this world, right? Which obviously he means to tell him, right? Right. Right now you're all physically downtrodden, right? You guys are and so, like, why would somebody want to be one of you guys if you guys are being stepped on, right? You guys are suffering. So he has a very interesting answer here, which I kind of love, and you may be able to use this depending on whatever debate you may be having with somebody or discussion. But I kind of smirk a little, and you'll see why in a minute. It's kind of funny in a way. So 113, paragraph 113. Amar Chaver. So the Chaver, the rabbi, answers as follows. And before I read the words, I'm going to tell you outside what he's going to say, right? So he says, everyone talks about, oh, you see the Jews, the Muslims, we're powerful. By this time in history, we control all of Arabia. We control all of North Africa. We control half of Southern Europe. We control half of Spain. We are powerful. We're strong. We're great. Look at us, right? And look at the Jews, right? They have to pay extra taxes. They don't have civil rights. They get thrown around. They're impoverished, and so on. And the Christians are doing the same thing. We control all of Rome and Italy and all of Europe, most of Europe at least, and Spain, and we have powerful kings with gold and silver and thrones and armies and everything. And look at those Jews, right? They're all suffering and everything. But meanwhile, when you talk to people, meanwhile, when you talk to people, Christians or Muslims, they always talk about their past. They brag about the martyrdom of the founders of the religion, right? How they were downtrodden, how they were stepped upon, how they were, and they glorify those days, and they talk about how wonderful that was, that they were so so you're using this against me. You're telling me now that some kind of a proof against Judaism, that we're living the life that everyone else brags about, right? All the other religions are constantly bragging about how they're martyrs and how they're suffering for the cause and how they were tortured and how they were this, right? So he's going to say right away, all of the great people of those religions, they're constantly bragging. Don't they look and they bring proofs? If somebody smacks you on the right, give him your left cheek, right? I don't get that's. I'm It's a verse in the New Testament. If someone knows it, they can quote it properly. But he's quoting. This is a Hebrew translation of an Arabic translation of somebody's version of what it says in the New Testament. So just forgive me if I didn't say it correctly. But the idea is the point, right?
You quoted it correctly, but the New Testament corrupted Eicha. Eicha Yirmiyahu says we did give our beaters the other cheek, but he's lamenting about it, and they said, "Oh, this means we have to do it."
Okay. All right. Well, fine. Yeah. So v'hanotelas milcha, if they take your cloak, tenlos gutancha, give him your robe, right? Huva chaver, he and his friends. He over here is specifically referring to Jesus, but he doesn't say his name. He and his disciples, right? V'seyato, and those that joined them and followed after them. Sablu b'meshach me'os shanim, for hundreds of years they suffered from cologne, from ridicule, makos, and they were struck the hereg, and they were killed. Right, and they reached their great heights of religious greatness, and right in this situation. And since then, all the Christians are looking back at all of the downtrodden and how terrible they and how they were martyred the first few hundred years of their religion. So why are you using that against me? We're just going through the same thing that you guys went through, and you guys brag about it. And now you're telling me that, oh, it's proof that somehow I'm less than you because now I'm suffering? Like, no, I'm sorry, man. We're just going through what you guys are bragging about, right? So, Islam, and the same thing goes for Islam. They all talk about the suffering. I mean, the whips and the this and the that. There's all kinds of things that they suffered from, right? Until they eventually overpowered those that persecuted them, and they won. They show us all about, and they tell us all about the stories of the old martyrs and how much they suffered. Right? Shekvodam Rav. They don't brag about the guy who was rich and living high on the hog, right? Or maybe the Muslims weren't on a hog, but whatever. They were living high and rich, and to say, oh, he's the greatest religious guy in the world because he had a harem with 700 women and bigger than your king's harem, right? Shultonam Nirchav, they have a great country. Kashali Kanis Aleim Musvinaseim Atilos Ema, right? It would be where am I? I'm in 113, right? I just want to turn the page so I stay together with you guys, right? So the fact that we're suffering means we're even closer to God, right? Don't use the fact that we're suffering to show that we're away from God. If anything, we're closer. So this is, I mean, you might need to word it a little differently, but this is something you can even throw into a modern debate, right? So Kuf Yudalid, paragraph 114. So Amar Kuzari. So the Chazar king says back. Remember, this book is 1,000 years old. I want you guys to keep that in mind. And it's just fascinating how the same old stuff is still bouncing around, right? But but he says the Chazar king. So he says, Kach haya elu. He said, wait a minute. You guys aren't choosing to live that way. If it was up to you, you wouldn't be persecuted, right? Right? You're being persecuted, but not because you want to be, right? If I gave you a choice and said, how about come and not live under persecution, right? Right? If you guys had the choice, right? You would go and start killing your enemies, right? You'd be in charge, and you'd be the boss, and you'd be killing your enemies. At least that's what the Chazar king says to the rabbi, right? It's just you happen to be weakened. You happen to be living in a lowly state right now, but it's not because you want to be that way. So Amar HaChaver. So the Chaver says, you're right. You've found my shameful parts. You've exposed my vulnerabilities, right? Because it's true, right? In other words, why are we in exile today? Why are we suffering? It's because of the deeds of us, right? It's because we didn't behave ourselves, right? Because of sinas chinam, because of hatred, because of infighting, and all of that. Chazal say that our temple was destroyed. We were exiled because of all these things. I apologize. I just need to check and make sure I did not need it up on labor delivery, but I'm good. Nothing to do with that. But so Melech HaKuzar, I'm king of the Chazars. You have exposed my shame. Achen, however, Lu Bacha Rubenu, Kafisha Ata Omer. Right, had most of us accepted our lowliness, right? Kafisha Ata Omer, the way you say, accepted our humility, right? Lekabel of et hashiflos mitoch kniel Elohim v'toraso, right? Not our lowliness in comparison to other nations. No, that we don't have to accept, right? That because Rabbi Yehuda Levi is definitely not advocating for. If anything, he's advocating for the opposite. But our lowliness in comparison to God, right? Our humility before God. Had we accepted our humility and realized, our true place in this world and not have been arrogant, then lo haya hadavar eloki, then the godly spirit, the spirit of God, would not have abandoned us for such a long time. The reason why he sent us into exile, the reason why he took our independence away, the reason why he threw us out of our land is because we were arrogant. And as we see in all the books of the prophets, we had the opportunity to turn our ways around and be humble before God, but we weren't. And it's interesting, the Rabbi Yehuda Levi here is telling us the bottom line. And if anyone has listened to my podcasts on Tanakh, they would know that I emphasize this all the time. That almost all the prophecies boil down to arrogance and pride versus humility, right? And you can boil it all down to that. So had we known that, right, then we wouldn't be suffering like we are. Only a few of us have achieved that spiritual level of true humility. Most of us as a people didn't do it properly, and here we are. L'rov yesh zachar, right? To most people, there is some reward. Because everyone, all of us Jews, whether we are spiritually uplifted or not, all of us are suffering together. So even if it wasn't by our own choice, even if we're not being humble by our own choice, we still do get reward for it, right? But ki'ilu ratza, because God knows, and this is fascinating, God knows very well that if any Jew wants, in 1 minute, he can get out of this situation of being a Jew with just saying one statement, right? Right? All he needs to do is go to the Muslim, if he's in a Muslim country, and say the Shahada, and poof, right? If he wants to go to the church and say that I'll be a Christian, poof, he can get away from it. And God knows that every Jew has that option, but we don't. We don't do that, right? So we all deserve special reward for not succumbing to that pressure. As we know, many people in history did succumb to that pressure. When you live in a world where, in order to get a job, in order to get a license, in order to go to college, in order to do anything, you needed to be a Christian or you needed to be a Muslim. It was very tempting, and some people fell for that, but the bulk of our people didn't, which is why we're still here, right? And God knows that it's easy, and it's easy to do. Just like you said, all you need to do is just make a few statements and you're done, right? It would have been no trouble. In fact, it would have made your life a lot easier. Also. So this is true whether you're a great rabbi or you would have immediately been the same as the guy who's stepping on you. You would right away have joined his club, right? They're tormenting you because you're Jewish. All you need to do is convert, and then you can be among the tormentors. Shofet tzedek lo ya'abed davar kagon zeh. A true judge, a righteous, a just judge, as God, of course, is, will never ignore such a thing, right? He knows what we're going through for the sake of staying on his path, right? And therefore, if we go through and suffer through this exile that we're in for the sake of heaven, and we learn that humility that he just talked about, karoi, appropriately, hayinu pe'er hadar HaMashiach hamatzupa. Then when that day comes, when the day of Mashiach comes, right, that we're all hoping for, and this exile, this terrible exile is over, we will be rewarded for being faithful. And by this behavior, we're going to bring that time even closer. Again, a very important thing here is that it's us. No matter which school of thought within Judaism you are regarding what it means that Mashiach, the concept of Mashiach, because there's a lot of different conceptions of what Messiah, what we're looking forward to, what the world to come, et cetera, et cetera. There's one common denominator that's a thorough and important common denominator that pretty much defines you as Jewish as opposed to other religions, and that is that Mashiach is something that we bring. It is our efforts. Now, you can look at it in a more spiritual way. We bring it by doing mitzvos. We bring it, or you can look at it in a more practical way. We bring it by doing social justice in this world, and so on and so forth. But the underlying theme of Judaism, and this is crucial, and the Kuzari is mentioning it here, is that it comes because we bring it. It's not something that comes from heaven and saves us, right? It's something that we bring about. And I cannot emphasize enough how important that is as one of the most basic concepts in Judaism that comes forth at almost pretty much a defining concept. And it's something else that when you have discussions with people of other religions and they want to understand some of the differences, this is a concept that you should probably mention as well. Anyway, anu einon einenu osim l'shava elatzmenu eskola makabel sustenu b'mila achas bilvad. Right. So we are not. So now he's going to talk about and he's going to make some of his points by talking about how a person becomes a convert. Right. The way somebody becomes one of us, becomes equal to one of us, who converts to Judaism, right? We don't do it the same way that by making a statement. We don't say, okay, come here and say this word to make the statement, declare that you believe in fill in the blank, right? And you're in, right? It doesn't work that way, not at all, right? Anyone that knows anything about the process of conversion to Judaism understands what it includes, right? There are actions that one needs to do that are difficult, that are challenging. One has to accept upon himself to live by the precepts of the Torah, which are, those of us that grew up doing them, they might be a little bit easier, but we certainly realize how all-encompassing they are and how they rule how we act and do every single day, right? Kigon Tahara, the issues of purity, limud, study of Torah, mila, circumcision, umasim rabim, and tons and tons and tons of actions that we must do al piyat Torah, that the Torah commands us to do. Kol shekein and minag kiminagenu, and certainly if and they take upon themselves the customs and join us as a people. And mitanoi hamila v'siboseh, and you have to. It's more than that. It's more than just doing the actions, but part and parcel of those actions is sheyizkar tamet sheyosel is remembering, like for the circumcision, to remember the point of the circumcision. Just to go and have your foreskin cut off is not enough. You have to understand what it's a sign for, what it means, what it represents. Otherwise, there's no point. Such a person that just happens to have a circumcision isn't automatically Jewish, right? He has to have a circumcision and understand the meaning and purpose of it, right? He has to understand that this is, and the reason why God made this sign on a man's sexual organ, right, is because this is a part of our body which is used for desire, to fulfill our physical desires, right? And we want to make sure that you understand that your physical desires need to be ruled by the Torah. It has to be used properly, right? His purpose is to beget children in the proper time, in the proper way, with the proper woman, etc., right? So that the child should be born in an appropriate way, in an appropriate relationship. And a person that attaches himself in this way, such a person has now attained the opportunity to have a portion of this special closeness with God, right? So the bottom line is that we don't just doing something isn't enough, right? Just saying something isn't enough, right? But kabbalas ol hamitzvos, accepting upon yourselves these actions is part and parcel of it, and not just accepting the actions, but understanding the meaning and purpose behind all of them. He used an example of milah, of circumcision, because it's inherent to the process of conversion. But of course, that would apply to any mitzvah, right? Just to say that I'm not going to work on Saturday is not enough, right? You have to understand what the purpose and point of it is, etc. Misha Davak, okay. Imzos lo yishta, and he's about to say one of his most controversial statements, which, and I'm going to tell you right now that the Rambam certainly and probably most Rishonim disagree with this statement. So this would not be a considered standard Judaism. This is a statement that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is making through the mouth of the Chaver, but I'm going to tell you now that the vast majority of poskim, the vast majority of Jewish scholars do not agree with this statement. And that is that even though this convert, right, has imzos lo yishtav, it has joined us and has now become closer, he's still not the same as a person, El Ezrach, a person who is born Jewish. Shekain Raka Ezrachim Rim Lenavua, in the sense that only one who is born, because remember, he gave us that whole speech about how, the father to son transmission of that special quality. So he's kind of boxed himself into saying that only a person that was born with that special quality can approach God through prophecy, right? Meirav Masha Acher Michol Nagieh Love Hu Blumod Mehan Beleosas Chosim Ulmadim Achlon Neviim. They can become great people and they can become great teachers and great scholars and have a portion in the Jewish people, but they can't become prophets. And this is really a chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, which did not hold water, and the vast majority of poskim, even non-Maimonidean Jewish thinkers, didn't agree with him on this count. Most famously because we have one known prophet who Chazal, Shas, I mean the Gemara contradicts him, the Talmud contradicts. The Talmud talks about the prophet Ovadia. We have the book of Ovadia, which is a book, one of the Trei Asar, and Chazal tell us that he was a ger, he was a convert from Edom. He was a ger Edomi. He was an Idumean convert. So I'm just stating that, but that's what it's one of his probably most controversial statements. But what he said in the beginning, we can certainly learn from, and it's important to know his opinion about this prophecy. Whether you like it or not is a different story, but to be aware of this opinion that they can't have prophecy. Regarding those promises that stimulated your wonder, right? And by the way, he's basically saying now, I'm right now on page 136 in this version, in the Korubkin here, right? So if you remember, so he was talking about the Gan Eden, the afterlife, all the wonders of the paradise. And he already emphasized to us that in Judaism, that's not what it's about, right? We do things because it's the will of God, because we want to develop a relationship with God, right? Not because of some promise that's going to happen. But we do know, anyone that has learned Chazal, that has learned through the Talmud, has learned through Medrash, has learned through Jewish tradition and writing since then, that there are plenty of writers that do talk about, and plenty of places where the rabbis do talk about visions of what paradise or what Gan Eden, what the afterlife is like, both in good ways and in bad ways, right? So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi doesn't want to leave us with the idea that Chazal doesn't have anything to say about the afterlife, right? Because if you stopped here, we would think that Judaism doesn't have anything to say about that. Now, there are some Jewish thinkers that would be fine with that, that I don't know what happens after that. Remember, Rambam famously doesn't discuss really the afterlife other than to talk about how as we perfect our intellects and bring our intellects closer and closer to godliness and to what he calls the active intellect, on that level, we achieve some form of eternal existence as a part of that active intellect, which is almost part and part of the intellect, which is angelic and attached to God and so on. But that's all. But the Rambam doesn't mention at all. Maimonides doesn't talk at all about the details of what's going to be in the future world, and many people assume that he doesn't even necessarily hold that such a thing is true. However, we do know from the Talmud, we know from Medrash, we know from tons of rabbinic literature that this subject is discussed. So he's going to touch on that now. And as for those issues, because you did mention the other religions talk about all these wondrous things that await the good person and all the terrible things that await the bad person. So Chacham, he says that's not new. These are religions. They got it from us, right? All the stuff that they put into their canon, right? They got from things that the rabbis wrote about in their imaginations, right? It's all there. And he's kind of right, very much right about this. All of those imaginings, which are really just the rabbis imagining wonderful things, right? And they became part of the canon of the religions that succeeded Judaism by several hundred or several thousand years, depending on the situation, right? So Chachamenu Ekdimu V'Teru Eskaneden Veskehenim Umadadu Osam Lorach Lorchav. They measured it out. They told us how big the heaven is and hell is. V'Teras Oneg, and they talked about the pleasures that are there, V'Et Yisurim, and the punishments. V'Ofen Mematze Yoser Me'asher Dasar Groves. They talk about even more than those other religions do. Anidi Barti Elacha Me'az, right? And that which I spoke to you before, Basi Rakal Pianemar Bekisve Divrei Anaviyim. But what I originally told to you was just the basics, that which is written in the words of the prophets. And in the words of the prophets, there's really not a lot. The prophets, the Torah itself, the Nevi'im, the prophets themselves really don't talk very much at all. Barely anything. He's like maybe a tiny mention here, a tiny mention there, but barely even a word about the future. And there's a reason for that, right? Because of what the Kuzari told us before, right? That's not the point, right? But if you want to know about it, however, they are common and frequent in the words of the rabbis. However, it is true, though, that in the words of prophecy, we do have, some mentions that hint to us that such concepts exist, right? Which is important. In other words, there is eternity, but they don't describe eternity, right? Right? There is, something. There is an ultimate justice, right? But they don't describe what it's like, right? So because they do mention the Chazaras offer migufadim al offer that the person's body returns to dust, the Chazaras ruach, but the spirit returns to its creator. Shanasanosa v'chein nizkeres b'divrei hanavua hachiyas hamesim ba'asid. We do have mention of tchiyat hamesim, which is really, I'm pretty sure he's referring to the mentions in Daniel. There's brief mentions of the revival of the dead, right? And a little bit maybe in Yeshayahu, depending on how you read the pasuk. Ushlichas Navi Akari Elayo, and the idea that one day Elijah the prophet is going to come. Shekvar Nishlach Ba'avar, he was already here once upon a time with us, teaching us Ve'elim Hello, so but he went up to heaven. Kishem Shala Tzulaso, in the same way that there were others that went up to heaven, like Chanoch, so on. V'nemar Shehu Lo Tam Tam Mavas, it says that he never really died. These kind of things. V'yesh b'Torah, and we see in the Torah a hint, because we see the Tefillah Shel Misha Esnabe B'Rishus Elohim, that there was someone who gave prophecy from God, that was Bilam, right? Which is interesting because he just said that non-Jews can't have prophecy, and Bilam is an example of a non-Jew who was a prophet. But so, I'm not going to deal with that obvious self-contradiction within one page. But regardless, the Bilam was a prophet, and what did he pray? He said he prayed that his death should be easy. What was the verse? Let me pull it up again. Tomos nafshi mos yishara. May my death be like the death of the straight, proper ones, of the upright ones, and my end should be like him. So clearly, he's referencing, according to at least the Rabbi Levi, he's referencing the world to come. So, I want to be like them. And the end of the show, I want to die like they die. I want to go where they go, right? So Melech Echad Shal Navi Mason, we also find the story of the prophet who had died, which is Shmuel, right? We see the famous story where Shaul, the king Saul, who asked the necromancer to bring Shmuel's soul up from the dead, right? And he gave him prophecies, just like he prophesied when he was alive. He gave him prophecies about what's going to happen even after he was dead. So you see that his soul lives on. Even though that which this king did, Saul did, Lisholas HaMesim, is Meguna Lefi Torah Seinu. The Torah derides that. The Torah tells us we're not supposed to do that. But he did it. But it shows that it exists. We see that even back then, even in the time of the prophets, our people understood that the soul continues after death, which is why they wanted to consult these souls. Now, by the way, many of the Maimonidean commentaries on that story of Sheol, including I'm going to say Rabbeinu Saadia, it would be kind of anachronistic to call him Maimonidean because he preceded Maimonides by 100 or so odd years. But he was Maimonidean in the sense that he was also a rationalistic Jewish philosopher, and others besides, I think he quotes Chofni going. If you go to my podcast, Let the Prophet Speak, on that parak in Shmuel, I went through different opinions, but the rationalistic commentaries don't interpret that story that Shmuel was actually raised from the dead. They have a much more interesting story. They claim that the whole thing was all smoke and mirrors, and the woman was taking advantage of Saul because he was in desperate situation, so he'd believe anything, and it was all, just playing games, and it was not true. But regardless, Rabbi Levi clearly understood, like many people understand, that to be actually bringing Shmuel's soul from the dead. But regardless, however you look at it, the fact that he's bringing that story to show us that not so much that Judaism understands that there is such a thing as a soul that persists after we die, because he established that Chazal, the rabbis, did tell us about a soul that persists after we die. But how do we know that in original Judaism, during the time of the prophets, right, that in Judaism in its earliest forms, that we even then knew and understood that there was a soul that persists after we die? So for that, he proved it, and this is a good proof, whether you're a rationalist thinker or not. The people believed that there was a soul, which is why they went to the necromancer. And then he brought those other smaller proofs, but like Bilam's prayer and other things, which and the mention in Daniel and the mention in Yeshayahu that hint towards an afterlife. So he kind of adequately presented that the idea of a soul that lives after life is an idea that's been part of Judaism forever. He's telling the king, the Chazar king, don't worry, we had this idea, and this idea has been around. And also, when we begin our prayers in the morning, even the women and everyone who wakes up in the morning, actually, it looks like we may actually finish the first essay tonight. And anyone of great spiritual growth, everyone knows this by heart. I can't help but mention this. Many of you probably heard, of the young man who was driving to the Nova Festival right before October 7th, and he was singing in his car a tune to these words: Elokai neshama shenasata bi, God, the soul that you placed within me. And he was singing a beautiful song, and he recorded himself. He ended up getting killed on that day, and they found his phone, and you can get a recording, and it's heartrending, and it tears my heart up to pieces every time I hear it, because of, especially given the meaning of this prayer that most of us know. We say it every morning. It's one of the first prayers we say in the morning, and I'll translate. Elohai, my God, Haruach Shenafachta Bi Mekudeshes, right? He had a little bit of a different version than we have, but it's the same idea, right? The spirit that you breathed within me is holy. Ata Borah, you created, V'ata Shomra, and you guard it. V'ata Lo Kamimeni, and you take it from me. V'ata Machzira Elai, and you return it to me, Ba'olam Hazba, in the coming world. Kol Ochi Melavosi, as long as it is with me, Ashabchacha, I will praise you, V'odolach, and I will give thanks to you, Elhei Olamim, God that is forever. Hashevachacha, all praise is due to you, who Hamachzir Asuruach L'guf Mesim, who returns the Spirit, the Holy Spirit that's within us, to bodies that are just worldly, physical, otherwise dead bodies. Gan Eden Atzmo, and the whole concept of Garden of Eden, that people all over, in other words, in all those other religions, they talk about Eden. It's all Lukwach min Torah. It's all taken from the Torah. It's the level that was meant for human beings. Lule Himra, had he not rebelled, we would all be in this Garden of Eden. Gehenna hu makam uforsam, and the idea of Gehenna, of hell, of Gei Ben Hinnom, is a place. We know the place. Anyone that's been to Jerusalem knows that should know, if you had a good tour guide at least. If you don't, let me know, because my son's a tour guide. He'll take you there. But the Gei Ben Hinnom, right, Karav Yerushalayim, it's near Jerusalem. Chafira she'enei kavaba. It's a place where there's constant fire burning. Sorfim bo atzomos atmeos. It's where they would burn bones that became defiled. And unfortunately, during certain times in our history, it was used for child sacrifice. It's hapigarim yes atumos habitu gehinom hu ivri morkav. The idea gehinom means the valley of Hinnom, which is a valley which exists today, and anyone can go to Jerusalem and walk around there if you want. It's an interesting place to walk around. So Amar Kuzari. So the Chazar King says, and this is 116 now. I am on page 140, right? So if that's the case, there's not, these other religions didn't really come up with anything new after what was already written in your Torah. And maybe some details they might have embellished about what heaven is like and what hell is like, and so on. But essentially, and to not just embellish it, but to increase its importance, right? Right, and be more, and to speak about it more, and to make it into a bigger deal, right? As opposed to your religion, where it's really not a major topic of discussion. And Kuf Yud Zayin, this is 117, the end of the first essay. Omar Chaver Achein V'gam Zeinu Chadash. This is even the details that they use to embellish it. That's not new either. Our rabbis have lots to say about this. There's nothing that you won't find in our sages if you don't look for it. And it's interesting because this isn't exactly what he's talking about, but you find this a lot. There's so many sayings that go around that are attributed to Jesus or the New Testament that obviously things that contradict the Torah you won't find in the Torah, but so many statements that you ask people, where does this statement come from? If you ask a Christian, it's in the New Testament. Well, I mean, it was in the rabbinic literature hundreds of years before that, and the writers of the New Testament, most of them got it from the rabbis they learned it from when they were studying in the rabbinic schools. I mean, these statements were around for a long time. Of course, the most famous being what Christians call the Golden Rule, which preceded Jesus by at least 400 years in the rabbinic literature. But regardless, and it's all there, it's all written. There's nothing new, but it's just other religions taking what we had already written and making it into theirs, and then hanging their hats on it, and claiming that it's essential to their belief system. And it's the same way here regarding this subject. So this really ends the first essay. So I hope you enjoyed essay number 1. We have about 8, 9, 10 minutes to talk. So if anyone has comments, questions, observations, fire away. Floor is open. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You had said about 15 minutes ago, Jews bring the Messiah. And
yes.
Could you expand on that? I remember it said if all the Jews would observe 2 Shabbats, then the Messiah.
Right. So, there's a lot of statements like that, right? And so the point being, it's not so much, it's not like a magic trick, right? The point is that Mashiach, in the Jewish conception of Mashiach, of the Messiah, is very different from the Christian conception of the Messiah, right? And it's very hard to even have a conversation about the Messiah with the Christian, because when they ask you the first question, which is virtually almost always, why don't you believe in Jesus being the Messiah, right? The Torah talks about the Messiah. Well, we can debate that a million times, and that's really not the purpose of tonight's lecture. But the idea is, the main point is not so much whether or not he was the Messiah. It's how you conceive of a Messiah in the first place, right? Is the Messiah somebody that comes down from heaven to somehow redeem us from whatever the hell you want to redeem us from, our sins, or to help us get to heaven? Or that's not the Jewish conception of what Messiah is, right? The Jewish conception of what Mashiach is that we are tasked, right, to to live our lives in such a way that we bring about a time which is the time of Mashiach. And when we are worthy of such a world, right, that the leader who we will find and who will arise out of that milieu, out of that world, that will be the Messiah, right? So Mashiach is very much a bottom-up idea, not a top-down idea. The Jewish idea of Messiah, you will never, ever find, and I can tell you, you won't find this in Kabbalistic literature. You won't find it in Maimonidean literature, rationalistic Jewish literature. You won't find it in late Yehuda Levi's literature. You won't find it in poems. You won't find it in piyutim. You won't find it in the Siddur. You won't find it in any Sefer and Tanakh. You will never find any Jewish source ever that doesn't talk about us bringing Mashiach when they talk about Mashiach. Right. And you can test me on that. You can try me on that. And if you find otherwise, please show it to me. Right. But Mashiach is always being brought by us. So that statement that you just made about keeping 2 Shabbats is a good one right there. What brings Mashiach? Us living the way God wants us to do. Right. By keeping 2 Shabbats. Right. Or doing extra, that's a central idea in Judaism, and it's really at the core of what our religion is, right? We were put on this world to do a job, and God gave us instructions of how we're supposed to do it, and if we do it, then we will merit to live to the time when the world gets redeemed from all of the craziness that this world is, right? And it's up to us to do it. Now, some people have mystical ideas. We need to go up to mystical heavens, all kinds of mystical things. Some people have, let's keep Shabbat. Some people say we have to keep halacha better. Some people say we have to do more social justice. We have to be nice, we have to be less arrogant and more humble. All of those things are all part of Judaism and different aspects. And and even Maimonideans, we have to be philosophize and think and study and learn and whatever aspect of Judaism you want to pick and what you want to emphasize as to how we go about bringing about such a world. You'll find a lot of different things, but it's always based on us, and that's 100% of the time. Anyone that comes to you and says, "Well, why don't you believe in a Messiah who came down from heaven to redeem us?" Because that's not what Messiah is. I don't care what his name is. I don't care what. I don't give a damn if his name is Jesus or his name is Joe Schmo. It doesn't make a difference, right? Right. The point is your entire concept is wrong. You have the wrong idea. I don't believe in someone who came to redeem me because that's not what my Torah taught me. My Torah taught me that it's up to me.
So, Saul, I have a question. I've
ahead.
heard that the Messiah may not be as much a person as a time of what you're describing. That it's not really a person; it's an event, and it's a situation where everything is made more perfect in the world, and it's not a person necessarily at all.
Well,
is there a concept like that, and where did that come from?
There could be such a concept, right? And and we do find that within Judaism, an emphasis not so much on the figure, the person, but on the yemos, on the times of Mashiach, right? And this isn't a lecture on Mashiach, but it did come up in tonight's lecture, so I guess maybe it is a lecture on Mashiach. But anyway, but the point is still the same. No matter what vision you have of the Mashiach, right? Whether he's a person, right, or whether it's a time period, it's really a combination of all of the above or some of the above, but it's still a result of our efforts, right? It's still a result of us making it happen. Did the world?
My question, yeah, I understand, but my question is, which trend of thought do you see Judaism expounding? A person or an era?
Most of the this is going to be my argument. I'll say it, and some people might like it, some people might not. But most of the literature until about 200 years ago, right? People conceived of leadership as monarchies, right? That's the only leadership the world knew until the American Revolution, right? So when when we looked at leaders, right, when we looked at someone who's going to come, or some way that this world, we looked at a leader, a person, a figure who's going to lead the world towards this justice and righteousness that we're looking for, and bring knowledge of God throughout the world. So there is good reason to understand, right, that monarch, that king, doesn't necessarily have to be a monarch in the traditional sense of a monarch, but it could be a government, right? It could be a structure of leadership. Maybe there will be a president or a prime minister or whatever, right? But it's there's nothing inherently wrong in saying that Mashiach is, when we develop a unified, a representative maybe body, right, that will be led by people, and maybe by a person who's righteous and just and so on. Whether that person is a king with the crown on his head doesn't really matter in our religion, right? So, and will thereby help bring about a world in which all of the peoples of the world will beat our swords into plowshares and stop shooting and killing each other, and start figuring out ways to get along with each other, and start figuring out ways to live together to make the world better. That will be Mashiach. Does you find throughout the Torah, there's lots of hints and references to that, especially in the book of Yeshaya, right? Because in the book of Isaiah, you find, if you follow it carefully from chapter, where is it that the Nachamu Ami is? I think it's 49. I keep forgetting, but somebody look that up for me. There's a point where Yeshayahu becomes disillusioned with Chizkiyahu, with Hezekiah. And Chizkiyahu was, in the Talmud, considered the potential Messiah. He could have been the one. He had the opportunity to do it, but he ended up failing, right? And then after that, immediately, Yeshayahu then emphasizes and says, Nachamu Ami, right? Comfort my nation, right? And he emphasizes the rest of the book of Isaiah talks about the nation of Israel, right? And the nation of Israel bringing the redemption. And he doesn't say barely a word about a person, right, who's going to come and do it. Until that point, until Yeshayahu was disillusioned by Chizkiyahu, he was talking about a person. Almost all of the prophetic pronouncements about a person are in the first half of the book of Isaiah. And the second half, Yeshayahu was disillusioned with Chizkiyahu, and all of a sudden he's talking about the people of Israel, right? So there's a lot of reason, and I'm not the only one to say this, but a lot of scholars think, and a lot of Jews think, and a lot of thinkers think, that what Yeshayahu is telling us is that it's no longer up to a person to come and save us, because we realize that a person will always get engulfed by selfishness. A person is always in danger of falling into that trap. But as a people, we could make it happen. And so, but this is, I did once a while ago say that I wanted to give a lecture series on what the concept of Mashiach, what the concept of Messiah is in Judaism. Maybe I will one day, but it would kind of go against my philosophy, or my strategy of only wanting to teach primary texts in all of these lectures. But what you just heard was me, not a primary text.
Well, it sounds interesting to me that, through the whole history of the Jewish people, there's always been this battle between, should we have a king or should we not have a king? Yeah. And it seems like it was, no, we don't need a king.
That's one of the biggest proofs. You're bringing up
a king, and then after that, Isaiah is saying, no, we don't need a king. It's funny how that keeps going on.
Wait, hold on. I need to stop the recording. So hold on.
Okay.
Wait, give me a second. Sorry about that. I figured we were asking good questions, so I'll keep the recording going. But so that itself is one of the biggest proofs that Mashiach isn't a figure, because a specific king type personality, because the whole concept of a king was a later concept. In other words, the original Torah's intent was that we shouldn't have kings, right? When you read through the Sefer Shmuel, right? He didn't want, so the whole idea of having a king from the house of David, well, there wasn't even supposed to be a house of David to begin with, right? At least according to Sefer Shmuel. There's other parts of the Torah which seem to hint otherwise. It's a long discussion. But certainly that stream of thought within the prophets would lead you to say, well, if there never was a house of David and we stuck without having a king, which is what the prophet Shmuel wanted us to do, right, was to never have a king in the first place, then how would we be imagining a Mashiach of some sort of king if we're not even supposed to have a king? But yeah, I mean, these are all so it's so one cannot say definitively that the concept of Mashiach being a king is a central idea to Judaism. It can't be, right? Because there's a significant thread of Judaism that doesn't even believe we're supposed to have a king, period. But it's an important discussion. There's just a lot to be said, but these are all really, really good points. But the bottom line that I did want to say is that all of these are wonderful things to talk about, and they're all great and they're important. But one thing is consistent, and that is the insistence that I said before, that it's up to us to make it happen. Mashiach is a bottom-up process, not a top-down process. It's a process of us being worthy of the time of redemption, right? We have to do it. No one's coming down to do it for us. Nobody's redeeming us. Nobody's getting our sins forgiven for us. The only way to get your sins forgiven is to repent on your own and fix your ways. That's the only way. There is no other way, right? Nobody's coming to save you from nothing. We don't need a savior because nobody's saving you. The only one that can save you is you, right? And that's it. Finished. And that's central to our religion. That's one of the most basic things about our religion. So, and it's something that we should understand. And that's really bottom line.
Rabbi Google says it's chapter 49 of.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was right. I said 49, right. Didn't I? All right. See, if Rabbi Google says so, then I'm definitely. It's easy to look up. As long as it's not Rabbi AI, because then you're totally out.
Rabbi AI, you're in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to end the recording. If people still want to talk, that's fine. But I'm stopping the recording.
Thank you, Saul.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Saul.